Welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. My name is Neil Harris, and today we're talking about testing and assessment. So my name is Neil Harris, and I work for a private language school called CELT in Cardiff. And my interest in this topic of testing and assessment has come from my experience of working both as an examiner. For many years, I had a number of roles working for Cambridge Assessment, but primarily from my work looking at the revision of an assessment scheme for a university pre-sessional. And our goal in that was to move away from the testing of performance and look much more at the concept of how we could use assessment to inform learning, both for the teachers and also for the learners themselves. And that's very much what I'm going to be talking about today. But as you can see from this slide, I'm beginning with something that is all about you, the people watching and participating in this masterclass. And I have some questions for you that I'd like to bring up on screen now and just give you some time to think about them. Those first two questions are about the involvement that you and your students have in terms of regular in-class tests, but perhaps also those tests that we often do mid-term and at the end of term to assess student progress. It may well be that also your students are preparing for external exams and high-stake exams, such as IELTS and the Cambridge exams. And then finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, the question is, are you clear as a teacher how you implement appropriate assessment tasks which reflect, and I think the key word here is changing learner needs? If you find yourself answering yes to any of those questions, then I very much hope that what I'm talking about today will be of direct interest and value to you and your students alike. So what are we talking about today? Well, there are a number of topics. I want very briefly to just ask the question, are testing assessment the same or different? I then want to look at a three-part view of assessment, which looks at the assessment of, for, and as learning. And then to give you a brief overview of an area which is becoming of more and more interest to ELT, and that's teaching for understanding, which I think very neatly takes assessment and places it in its rightful place, very much at the heart of a learning cycle. But more of that at the end of today's workshop. So let's start with that first question. Testing and assessment, are they same or different? Well, if you look at the literature, it really does seem to be the case that the terms are used almost synonymously. But I'm going to make the point today that we can view them as quite separate, and that is very much the view that I take. So on this slide is a quotation coming from a website for a company that is trying to promote its LMS, its learning management system. I think it's very interesting that today in the world of online teaching, that a company that is promoting its LMS should actually be looking at testing and learning in quite different ways. So I'll summarize the quotation, which hopefully you've had a few moments to glance at on this next slide. So it looks at tests as being a product which is done after instruction. So a bit like those end of course or end of term tests that I mentioned a few moments ago. The point here is that the test results are not interpreted. They're simply used as a way of measuring performance at the end of a given stage. They have no impact on instruction, or if you prefer, they have no impact on what we teach. Assessment is quite different. It's much more a process, and it's undertaken during the learning phases and at the end, and results are interpreted. Teachers sit down and make decisions which will affect what they teach and potentially how they teach as a direct result. So for the purposes of today, let's see tests as being a summative form of assessment, And let's see assessment itself as being formative. It forms the process of what we do and what the learner does. So let's begin by looking at assessment of learning and what that's all about. I'm sure we're all familiar, both as teachers, but also as test takers ourselves in the past, with this kind of picture. Students sitting behind desks being tested. And the quotation, I think, here makes a very clear point about what the assessment of learning is all about. Notice the points in red, done at the end of a course or a school year, in the format of an exam or a test, used to assign grades and report achievement or failure. And this, I think, is why it's referred to as high stakes. If you pass, you move on to do something more difficult, more prestigious, maybe enter university or a competitive entrance for a particular career. If you fail, those opportunities are no longer available to you. So these tests really are important. And I'm certainly not arguing in this presentation that they don't matter. But I think if this is the only way we test our students, they and we are losing out as a result. So if we just think a little bit more about testing as a product, then students get taught something, they receive input. As I've mentioned previously, they have this summative test, and at the end of which, they move on or don't move on, as the case may be. And key here is the fact that what we do as teachers isn't really changed as a result of the results. It's, if you like, a snapshot of the student's performance at that one time. Students in China will be familiar with the college English test, vital for their future. Students internationally doing an English language test, think of IELTS, and this is a good example of a summative test. So what are the key points here? Well, it gives us a snapshot, as I say, of this sum, hence the term summative, or the extent of students' learning at a particular point in time. It involves having tests which actually can be very difficult to write. They have to be standardized, they have to be valid, they have to be reliable. And very often it will relate to a specific course of study. It may be slightly more general in terms of its outcomes. There isn't a syllabus for teaching IELTS. It's simply a snapshot of your proficiency of English, or rather the student's proficiency of English at any one time. And I keep coming back to this point, it doesn't change what the teacher does in terms of what or how they teach. So as a result, the student is graded, and that might be against certain criteria. We have the CEFR, can-do statements. That would be an example of criterion referencing, or the students might be graded against one another. And there you might expect some students to do very badly, the majority of students to do okay, and another small minority of students to do very well. And it gives us a bell curve. Now, if we think of further examples of summative assessment of learning, you have here on screen some examples. And as I've said before, I'm not knocking this. We need a way of making entrance to university clear, and therefore an IELTS test, maybe not perfect, is an established way of checking English language proficiency against certain fixed criteria which are known. However, the point here is not that there is a problem with summative assessment of learning, far from it. But what I want to suggest in this masterclass is that it should be complemented by other forms of assessment, which students and teachers can have much greater control over. And that's what I want to move on to next when we talk about assessment for learning. So what's that all about? Well, Hopefully the images you can see on the left-hand side will be able to exemplify this quite well. Assessment for learning for me is not about testing, it's about assessing for learning. So notice again the points in red. It occurs at all stages of the learning process. Students have an active role. And if we go back to the pictures here on the left-hand side, what you'll see, there isn't a teacher pouring knowledge into her or his students, but much more, there is this kind of continuous feedback loop where everyone's efforts, everyone's work is affecting everyone else's output and input. So this is the point. Assessment for learning is designed that the learner is at its heart with the teacher, that it develops students who are self-regulated, a little bit more of that as we go along, and that enables students to really understand learning processes which will help them to become lifelong learners. It's referred to as formative assessment. And to quote the Assessment Reform Group back in 2002, this is a quotation from the British Council website, it's the process of collecting and interpreting evidence. Notice that word interpreting. Teachers will be using it, thinking about it. And then at the end, to decide where they are in the learning, and they refers to the teachers and the learners, where they need to go and how best to get there. So assessment then informs the pathway of learning. Putting it very simply, if you have an assessment for learning after a couple of weeks in a term, and you see that your students have done brilliantly in one area, but less well in another, assessment for learning enables you to change what you teach and potentially how you teach it in order to facilitate the students' learning and so that they understand better. It's a bit like going back over what you've done previously, which we know is useful for learning anyway, but also enables us to focus in on the areas where the students just need that extra little bit of help. So it's becoming quite clear, I think, already that assessment and assessment for learning is pretty much a feedback loop. We begin with the students receiving input, instruction as it referred to previously. Then there is some form of formative assessment where the student's understanding of what they've learned is assessed. Now, crucially, this doesn't need to be formal. It doesn't need to be a formal test with those students sitting behind desks as we saw previously. It can be much more fun. It can be much more the kind of thing that we do in our classrooms every day. And as a result of what they've learned and what they've not learned so well, input is revisited as a result of how the formative assessment is interpreted by the teacher. So there's a revision of teaching. And it's obvious where we can say, well, they didn't understand this aspect of the present perfect continuous very well, but it might also lead to a change in how the teacher teaches. They may realize that a series of gap fills only takes the students so far. And when they've been assessed orally, you realize that they may have declarative knowledge, they may know the form, but they really have trouble using it. And this may lead to a change in how they are taught in order to really get to the point of being able to use the language communicatively. So if we think about what teacher-created formative assessment might look like, this next slide gives you some hints. Formative because it's collected while the students are being formed. It might be teacher-initiated to gather information, but it relates very closely to the learner's course outcomes and their learning outcomes. It enables teachers to make decisions about what the students have or have not learned, and it creates those descriptive results, which enables decisions to be made about what happens as a result and what happens next. Now, where did this all come from? Well, back in the late 90s, Black and Williams were thinking about what classrooms look like and what happens in classrooms. And they made the point that the internal workings of the classroom, by which I think they mean learning, has traditionally been largely invisible. You can see the teacher teaching, and you can see the results of the teaching when it's assessed, but what's going on in the middle? So assessment for learning was an attempt to make this invisible, what's happening in the middle, more visible. And of course, this chimes in with later work done by Project Zero at Harvard University and by John Hattie, looking at this whole question of visibility, visible thinking and visible learning. And if you're interested in the touch points between today's masterclass and those questions of visible thinking and visible learning, do have a look at the wonderful session that's been provided by Andre Headland, looking at those very areas. So Black and Williams decided to call this invisible system the black box. And what they discovered, and this is key, I think, is that when students learn in a formative way, they achieve more and they obtain better results than students who were simply tested in the summative end of course, end of week fixed test. In other words, what happens is that what happens in the black box when it's informed by assessment for learning raises standards through classroom assessment. And that's exactly why Black and Williams decided to call their book Inside the Black Box, Raising Standards Through Classroom Assessment. Assess well, students will learn well. Okay, so let's just have a quick think about what are some of the key characteristics of assessment for learning. Well, assessment is embedded in teaching and learning. But crucially, the learning goals are shared with the students at all points throughout the learning process. And it aims to help students to have a clear insight of, well, what are we working towards and how am I going to be assessed in achieving those? Students, therefore, are let in on the secrets of the teacher. Even more interesting, I think, is that the students themselves are involved in this process. It can be self-assessment, it can be peer assessment, but they're not just waiting to receive some data from their teacher. They are actually involved in the process themselves. And this is where the becoming a lifelong learner comes in. If you can step back and reflect on your learning, then you're much more likely to be able to make wise decisions as a student about how you learn and what to learn. Now, if we think about it, this is key. A student who is not involved in self-assessment and an ability to say, well, this is going well, this isn't going so well, is always going to be beholden to a teacher to tell them what they should be doing and how they should be doing it. No, we want students who are much more self-involved. Now, clearly, this is something that the students themselves are going to have to be taught how to do. And so a key part of assessment for learning also involves learner training. And that can be achieved actually by example, and I'm in a few moments' time going to give you some examples of ways in which this is achieved. So once they've been involved in an assessment, the students receive feedback, and that gives them clues as to what their next steps should be and how to take them. Again, it's about developing that self-regulated learner rather than the student who's entirely waiting for the teacher to instruct them in what, when, and how. And finally, this helps with confidence. And we all know how crucial confidence is to learning and how it fits in with motivation. Finally, teacher and student reflect on assessment data. You can see just how embedded the student is in this process. So let's think about some examples. And I put up on screen for you here a whole host of ways in which you can be involved. And I'm going to take a couple of them and look at them in a bit more detail. Vocabulary review quizzes, if you think about it, something we probably all do on a regular basis. We don't necessarily collect in the individual scores of each student, because that's not what matters. But by having the students involved in groups, reviewing activity, reviewing vocabulary learning, then you are in fact assessing their learning in a fun way, in a meaningful way. But you may just realize there are one or two words that they really struggled with if you're doing, for example, a vocabulary board race. So what do? You go back and you re-instruct. You look at the word and the phrase again with the students. That's a formative assessment for learning happening in real time. But, discussions with students where you realize, well, what have they got? What have they not got? Progress and end of unit tests can have their place in assessment for learning, as long as they are not do or die activities. If they're used judiciously to think, well, okay, I've got to the end of this unit, or I've got to the end of a mid-course in a test, mid-course test in a given period of time, a term, and the students are still really struggling with this. What does the wise teacher do? You go back and you look again. But as we move down this list, you're going to see areas of assessment which perhaps are less familiar. Getting the students to assess one another using tick boxes, questionnaires, and so on. Asking the students to write and remember at lower levels, this can be done in their L1, doesn't have to be done in English, about, well, in my last test, how well did you do? What did you do to be successful? What could you do differently next time to do better? And again, checklists and journals can be media for achieving these same goals. So all of these have a direct impact on student learning and teaching. So let's look at some examples of how you can incorporate this into your classroom. Well, back in the old days, back in the time when we were able to teach at a whiteboard, and of course, this is something that's always going to be the case. There will be a return to the whiteboard, and the whiteboard is always going to be part of our learning, be it online with a whiteboard using Google Classrooms, for example, or if we're in a physical classroom. It doesn't actually really matter, because whether we're using a whiteboard in a physical classroom for a board race, or if you're using, for example, online Kahoot, this can be a great way to review vocabulary. It ties in with the idea of spaced repetition, because crucially, the students are being assessed by way of reviewing vocabulary that they've seen previously. And with a growing understanding of the importance of evidence-based learning, spaced repetition is really taking its place in the physical classroom and the online language classroom as well. And if you're interested in this key concept for learning, then I do encourage you to look at Anna Kucha's Gallery Teachers Masterclass, where she looks at this concept of spaced learning and spaced repetition. Students, in essence, learn from the repeat exposure, but teachers also learn. And this is what we mean by interpreting results. The teacher will find out which phrases the student struggled with, which ones they need to go back to and review and perhaps look at anew. Another example, and this is one that I picked up when I was working in English for academic purposes, is 3 stickiest points. Basically, you need loads and loads of post-it notes, and you leave them dotted around the room, and the students at the end of the class simply note down their 3 stickiest points. And by that, I mean 3 things that they weren't clear about by the end of the lesson. This can be done in L1 or L2. There's an example here in L2 of a student who had been studying conditionals, and made 3 points. I don't know where to place the stress in the phrase would have passed my exam. I don't know whether it's has or have. She would have, or she would has passed her exam, and may or could be exchanged for would in that construction. And this enables the teacher to gather data on the teaching and the learning and to help with those problem areas. And, if you've got 20, 30 students, you collect them in, you look at them and you decide, are there common points here that I need to look back at for the class? Those of you teaching with huge classrooms, then at this point, you're clearly not going to be able, if you've got 100 and 150 students in your class, to look at every one of these. But what you could do is take a sample of 30. My third example in terms of assessment for learning is this one. And this is where self and peer evaluation comes in. Here on the right-hand side is an example of a self and peer evaluation sheet that I devised for the academic pre-sessional that I was in charge of in terms of the writing course. And so the writer completes a self-evaluation tick sheet. 2 peers complete the same sheet, and then the student who's written the essay takes 3 bits of evidence and uses it to write a new draft of the essay. Now, what you can't see on screen is the flip side of this peer and self-assessment sheet, where the student was also asked to make visible their learning. And they were asked to write, I have made the following changes to my essay because I think my essay now is because. So critical thinking came into it, but also it was foregrounding the changes. It was requiring the student to explain why they made those 3 particular changes. There may have been others they could have made as well, but it also asks them to self-diagnose the impact of those changes. In other words, you're taking the student on a journey where they become more able to evaluate their own work. Therefore, I think assessment for learning is a cline, and it starts at one end with teacher regulated in red at the end, going to the other end of student regulated. What I've tried to do is give examples of each. So a teacher-regulated activity may be where the teacher develops a vocab quiz for her students, but the teacher decides which words to review. Less teacher-regulated is where the students choose the words to review, but the teacher may tell them where they come from, yesterday's lesson. Going forward into the far end of student-regulated, where using things like, for example, those self and peer assessment sheets, students choose their own areas for self-evaluation and write a paragraph about how their self-evaluation has improved their work. And this really is now the cutting edge between assessment for learning and assessment as learning. Because as we can see at the bottom of the screen, the movement towards greater self-awareness and increased metacognition is in fact a key point for assessment as learning. So what is this all about? Well, it's a process where learners learn about themselves as learners and how they learn. And assessment as learning focuses on the processes of learning and the enabling of the student to become more independent and successful as a result of this self-awareness. Again, on screen, some examples of ways in which this can be achieved. The point here, this isn't a one-off activity. It's something that needs to be sustained in the classroom through learner training. It can be encouraged by guided interviews and tutorials with the learner. It can be done with how-to learner diaries and journals, but particularly useful, I think, is e-portfolios. And all of these activities lead towards the student learning how to take greater responsibility for their own learning and make wise decisions in monitoring their further direction as a learner. So if you think about e-portfolios, they're very common in the world of work. Work-based training and vocational training, e-portfolios are huge, but they can also be found in English for academic purposes. But I want to suggest they're just as appropriate for exam classes, for teacher education, and for general English. So the idea of a portfolio is the student selects evidence of their learning. So if you've got a group of students doing Cambridge First, they may well do a couple of writing tasks for each of the particular kind of writing that they have to do, the essay, the letter, the proposal, and so on. So you ask the students at the end of the course to choose which examples of their writing best exemplify what they've learned in that course. And then they write a little kind of overview, or they could do this as a video of what they chose and why they chose it. They can include with this, if they've been involved in self and peer assessment during the process, examples of that self and peer assessment sheets. And all of it comes together, not only as an evidence to a teacher of the student's learning, to a parent of the quality of their child's learning, but also crucially for the learner itself, him or herself, it's a really nice evidence of the path, the journey they've been on as more and more independent learners. So to conclude, I just want very briefly to explain this picture and how it leads on to the last section of this masterclass, because what we've got here is something being unveiled. But it's interesting, isn't it? What's behind the curtain, what's behind the veil, is what's in front of it. And I chose this image because I really wanted to make the point that in engaging in assessment as learning, what we're doing is giving the student power that previously was invested in the teacher. And by having that, and I perhaps use the word responsibility more than power, they're on the inside of the learning process. They own that learning process, and therefore, as a self-regulated learner, they can take themselves forward in the way that they want and choose to do so themselves. So to conclude, I just want as a tantalizing ending to try and bring all of these points and to synthesize them. And I'd like to thank Gabby, one of my colleagues and one of the staff working on these wonderful masterclasses, for her question to me about teaching for understanding, which in all honesty was something I knew very little about. This comes from Project Zero at the Harvard School of Education. And I've taken some screenshots for their website. And I think their mission statement here is really interesting. It's about understanding and enhancing learning, thinking and creativity for individuals and groups. And surely, aren't we all interested as teachers in understanding learning and enhancing it for and with our learners? So teaching for learning is a framework. I do encourage you to have a look at the Project Zero website. There's some pages dedicated to the Teaching for Understanding framework. And I just wanted to show you this quick slide here, which very clearly explains how teaching for understanding works. There's much more to it than assessment. But what I thought was particularly interesting here is the way in which there is an overlap between ongoing assessment, which we've talked about throughout today's masterclass, and how it overlaps with performances of understanding, making learning visible, and how they link into the understanding of goals. So there will be opportunity to talk about this in the accompanying question and answer session. So at this point, I just wanted to make some key points about teaching for understanding. And you'll see how much it overlaps with what we've been talking about so far today. The articulation of learning outcomes at the beginning of the lesson, they here talk about performance, the fact that it should be relevant, and that it is for public use, which is really very much similar to visible learning. That feedback needs to occur frequently. And if we're assessing for learning, we are giving feedback. It gives it clear guidance, not only on how well the student performed, but how to improve. It informs what the teacher does next, and it comes from a variety of perspectives. So I think what teaching for understanding does is that it is a framework for actually taking assessment for learning and assessment as learning it and putting it into a wider framework for the classroom. So to conclude, yes, summative testing is important, but there is so much more to it, and it's so much more powerful when we embrace formative assessment. Good assessment, formative assessment for learning enables our learners, and it produces better teaching. Assessment as learning can create lifelong learners, learners who are more in control, they have self-regulation, they're better able to learn. And I think really importantly, it's now the time that English as a foreign language and English language teaching generally looks towards mainstream education for ideas to further professionalize its practices. Quick review of the reading list for this session today. And of course, can I remind you of this wonderful resource of ELT gallery teacher masterclasses, which are available online. I'm very honored this is going to be one of them. And I very much look forward to hearing from you, your thoughts on this session as we move forward. Thank you. Testing and assessment are sometimes used interchangeably in the literature, which can be really confusing. But in my view, testing is really to do with end of course summative assessment. It's used to make decisions about a student's future. Assessment is, for me, much more interesting. It's about how we can use evidence from students' performance in order to make informed decisions about what they, the learners, and we as teachers do together to make learning more successful, more enjoyable, and more memorable. Yes, in my view, that understanding of assessment definitely helps to make learning have more impact. If we understand, if we interpret the results of assessment, both informal, semi-formal, and more formal from our classrooms, as teachers, we're able to make decisions. And later on, if we involve students in the process, the students themselves can contribute to making decisions about what and how they learn. And by letting them in on the secrets of what's happening in the black box, of what's happening in classroom, by making the processes visible, we get much better outcomes as a result. Crucially, there is an evidence base for that. English language teaching is a highly professionalized industry, but what I think it has perhaps lacked in the past is looking to see what's happening in mainstream education and learn from it. And I'm really pleased that in these gallery teachers masterclasses, we're getting clear evidence of mainstream learning coming into English language teaching and to helping us teachers to be better teachers. Some examples of that: spaced repetition, something that Anna Kuchar will talk about in her masterclass of the same topic. Visible thinking, that's come from Project Zero at Harvard. Visible learning from the work of John Hattie. Both of these discussed by Andre Headland in his masterclass. All of these give important help to us teachers to improve ELT standing. And the point here is it is empirical and evidence-based. In other words, putting it bluntly, it works.